try to keep my...
What happens if I can't answer the questions?
Then, I don't know.
They're tough. Okay. I was, my full name, John Noah Bessendorfer, and I got the name of John from my grandfather, and Noah from my dad. So I have the name of John Noah Bessendorfer from my father and my grandfather. And I was born January 30th, 1937, so I'm 88 years old. No, yes, 88 years old. And I've lived here on the property that my grandparents basically homesteaded for 88 years, and our families have lived on the property here. When they came to this valley from Salt Lake area in 1889, they came to the valley. They drove all of their livestock up Parley's Canyon on a dirt road. It took 2 days for them to get here into the valley. And when they got right here to this property that we're on right now, it was nothing but sagebrush. There were no homes, no roads, no fences, no barns, and it was just sagebrush. And so my ancestors, my grandparents, started out from scratch. And they lived in a tent and under the wagon box while they built the home, which is still on the property. And then they settled in. It took all summer to build the home, and that became our homestead for ever since that time. So approximately 130 some odd years is what our families have lived on the property. And now when I first got here when I came along, growing up in the farmhouse, it was pretty primitive. We did not have running water in the house, and so a well was dug just about 20 feet away from the house, maybe 3 feet in diameter. A water well that was dug by hand. And so water was packed from the well into the house in a bucket. We would throw a bucket down into the well with a rope tied to it, and then we'd bring the water into the house, put it on a washstand right against the kitchen stove, and there the water was heated up. And when we had our Saturday night baths, we all lined up according to how dirty we were. And the dirtiest kid had to be last of all, so it didn't get the water too dirty. And you probably heard the old saying, "Don't throw the baby out with the bath water." And that shows how dirty the water could get after a few people have taken their baths in it. But the water was heated on the kitchen stove in a boiler, and then we had a big round tub right underneath by the front of the stove, and the water was poured from the boiler into the bathtub, and that's how we took our bath. Well, then, so we didn't have a bathroom in the house because there wasn't any running water in the house, but we did have an outhouse, and you probably know what an outhouse is. And so, and we didn't have a refrigerator in our house. We had a wood-burning kitchen stove, and also a stove in the living room. That was how the house was heated. And so on those cold winter nights, when it was really cold, somebody would have to get up in the night and put another log on the fire, so to speak. But we would heat a cobble rock on the stove, and we would wrap it up in a white flour sack and put it into our bed just before we went to bed, like a half hour before. That would heat the bed up, that hot rock in our bed. And the trouble was, before morning, it was wasn't hot, it was cold. And so it was good to stub your toe on in bed too. And so we didn't have a telephone. The electricity came to our home just a year before I was born. The lights that we had in the house were ones that hung from the ceiling with a cord, and you used a string to get the lights turned on. And then the telephone, we got that when we was like, I think I was in elementary school. And I looked forward to the time when we would get the telephone. And every day when I got home from school, I would say, "Is the telephone in yet? Is the telephone in yet?" Because I knew it was coming. I had seen the people digging the holes for the telephone poles, and it finally came. And so we picked up the telephone, my sisters and I, and we were scared of it. What did we do? In fact, we even held the wrong side to our ear and wondered why it wasn't working right. A party line, and we would, so there were about 6 families that was on the telephone line, and they could listen in on each other. We'd pick up the telephone, and the operator, who was in Heber, the telephone operator, would say, "Number, please." And so we would give a number, our telephone number. Our number was 4J2, and that meant that it would ring 2 times, 2 loud rings, and so then we would pick up the telephone and answer the phone. And when we wanted to make a call, then we would have to pick up the telephone, and sometimes the neighbors would be talking on the telephone. Maybe there was a possibility of 6 families that could be on there, but we'd have to wait until they got through before we could give our numbers. Sometimes if it was more like an emergency, we would say, "Could you please get off the line so we can make a telephone call?" But that's the way that it was. And then back to the point that was asked, the day that I was born was quite an interesting day. It was January 30th, 1937, a cold winter, snowy day. The snow was deep, but my mother wanted to be close to a doctor the day that I was born, and she was afraid that maybe the country doctor couldn't get to us at her house here. And so she went to my grandparents' house in Heber, and that's where I was born, in Heber. And after that, of course, then I was back to, we always call this Charleston, so back to our Charleston home. And when my dad got back from Heber to the farm there, my sisters wanted to see me, the newborn baby boy, their brother. And so my dad said, "Well, I'll take you up to Heber and you can see your new brother." And so in the process of getting to Heber, he had to cross the railroad track. And the snowplow had come by and even had to raise their blade so that there was too much snow on top of the railroad track. And when Dad got to that point, the car got stalled on the railroad track. It was stuck. And whenever you're on a railroad track, the natural thing is you look down and the train's coming. And it was. It was the Heber Creeper coming up the tracks. My dad got out of the car, walked down the railroad track, and stopped the train, the Heber Creeper. And some people got off of the train and walked up to where the car was and helped Dad push the car off of the railroad track. And so then my sisters and my dad continued on to Heber. My sisters got to see their new baby brother. And I don't know if they'd been used to seeing little babies, but they weren't too excited when they saw me. They said I was kind of red-faced, and the way they described it, maybe raw-boned. And so then afterwards, I kind of wrote this story, and I had to give it a title. And the title I gave to it was "Ugly Baby Stops Heber Creeper." And so that was the first day of my life. I remember lots of things over the years, things that happened and things like that.
John, can you go back and talk about where your ancestors came? We know that they came to Charleston, but go even further back.
Okay.
And how they got to Utah, and
Okay.
Salt Lake, and then Charleston.
Very good. Okay, then my grandparents on my dad's side, those were the Bessendorfers, they came from Germany, and they learned about the LDS Church in Germany and became members of the church. And they came to the area with the help of Carl G. Mazer, who was the president of BY Academy, and they became gardeners for him, and he helped bring them to America. And that was the starting of Brigham Young University. And after that, they didn't work there too long, and then they came up to Midway, and they bought a little farm in Midway. Well, it was actually 20 acres, and that is located on Stringtown Road and against Cascade Spring Road. And that's where their 8 children grew up there. One of the oldest sons was actually born in Germany when he came to Midway. And so they had the children there, 8 of them, and they ran the farm. And then my grandfather, Bessendorfer, he was called on a mission to go back to Germany, which he did. And in the process, he of course had to leave his wife and the 8 children there to run the farm while he was gone for 2 years. And when he came back from his mission, he only lived 2 more years and then passed away. But they were well acquainted with all of the people there at that time on Stringtown Road, and the Dirtschies, for example, they associated with them. My dad's oldest brother, he could yodel, and he would yodel in the mornings when he would get up, and the neighbor, guess about a block away, was one of the Dirtschie boys, and they would yodel back. So in the morning in Stringtown, you could hear the yodeling going on there at that time. But so that was my dad's side of the family, and they, by the way, they're buried in the Midway Cemetery, my grandparents, that they're buried there. On the other side of the family, my mother was a Casper, and so she was the one that came to this. She was born here on the property, on the farmhouse, in the farmhouse, and she lived 82 years and passed away. And after 82 years, she passed away in the very same room that she was born in, 82 years in between. And when she was baptized a member of the LDS Church, she was baptized in the Provo River. And she had 12 brothers and sisters, and she was the youngest out of 12 siblings. And from those siblings there were 50 cousins, they would be to me. 50 cousins were born over the years, and I was the youngest out of 50 cousins. All of those 50 cousins have passed away at the present time, and even all of their spouses have passed away. And it's the same thing with all my cousins on the Bessendorfer side. They've passed away, and there's one more that's still alive other than me. I'll tell you a little bit about Midway. I was a Boy Scout, and when I turned 12 years old, we had a camp out, and it was up in Snake Creek, and it was for the Boy Scouts from the whole county. We were there, and we had bonfires going, and it was my first camp out. And I had my new sleeping bag, and I was with 3 of the other boys from our troop, and we just laid down the sleeping bags in a trail among the trees, and then we went to the bonfire, the campfire, and heard the stories from some of the old timers of Midway, like Nephi Probst and Alma Huber, and they told stories about snakes and bears and cougars. And when they got through, I and all of us three boys that were together, we were so frightened. When we went back to where we had laid down our sleeping bags, we didn't sleep at all during that night. We were so frightened we thought we'd be attacked by something. But I remembered some of the stories they told about the snakes in Midway, and that's how Snake Creek got its name, from the snakes. And back at that time, where they have the open hot pots and that, you know, some are filled with water and some of them are empty. Some of the water's cold, some of the water is hot that's in those. But the empty ones was a gathering place for snakes there. And so they actually had a snake hunt in Midway, and there's accounts of where they, in one of those hunts, they were able to catch over 100 rattlesnakes. And they said the snakes down in those hot pots, the empty hot pots, they would, in the spring when it would get warm, they would come together in those, and they said they had seen big groups, bundles of those snakes as big as a bushel basket. And normally the heads were sticking out, and so they would take a long pole with a hook on the end, almost like a fish hook, but bigger, of course, and they'd reach down into those pots and grab the snakes by the neck, and they could pull them up out of there. And so the question might be asked, well, what did they do with the snakes? Well, they could actually get snake oil from those, and then they would put it in little bottles, and they could sell the snake oil. And I remember one person there in Midway, Clifford Prevost, and he lived down in the bottom end on Stringtown Road, and he had had a hearing problem for years and years. And so then they didn't know what to do about that. But they took some of the snake oil and poured that in one of his ears and gave him a blessing, and he was healed immediately and was able to hear again using snake oil. And there's lots of stories like that. One of the old timers in Midway was Conrad Gertsch, and he was nicknamed Cooney Gertsch. Cooney Gertsch, and he was the father and grandfather of like Lyle Gertsch and well, all of the Gertsches actually there. But he has some remarkable stories about him. You know, he would go up into to get timber in Midway, and the people would all in the fall would go to the hills to get timber for their stoves, wood burning stoves. And so he was there up on the side of the mountain, and he was there herding some of the Midway cattle that were up on those western mountains. And then another person came in down below him with to get wood with a team of horses and a wagon. And Cooney Gertsch looked down below and saw him down there, but the guy down there didn't see Cooney. And Cooney yodeled just as loud as he could. He made that yodel, and it scared the horses down below, and they ran away. And Cooney said, he says, I felt so bad for what the problem I caused there, yodeling, and made his horses run away, the team of horses. And so a lot of stories like that. And Cooney he was the herder for Midway, and all of the cattle were herded there together. He would get paid by the head of cattle, maybe like 5 cents a head per day. And one day he had, and they would drive the cattle right down Main Street in Midway. And he, on that one occasion, it was some kind of an animal, I guess a bull or something, and he had to throw a rock at it. And he threw a rock at it and hit it, And and when it hit the cow or the steer, it bounced off of the steer and hit another guy and knocked out one of his teeth, one front tooth. And Cooney said the same thing again. Oh, I felt so bad about that. And so anyway, back then in Midway, the street, Main Street, when they got into power lines, the power lines were right in the middle of the street in Midway. And they would oftentimes have horse races right down Main Street in Midway. But there were so many stories about those. I've read about them a lot in the past, and there's so many of them. The early history of Midway. There was the lower fort, or the lower settlement, and the upper settlement. And the lower settlement of Midway was where Sidney Epperson and Mark Benjamin Smith and Wood and Bronson and Jeremiah Roby, and those were the ones that first settled in the lower settlement, and then in the upper settlement, which was up closer to Snake Creek. But then eventually, and everybody knows the story of how the two groups came together, and they compromised and ended up calling it Midway. But in the lower settlement, they had one of the first grist mills, a flour mill, and that was by John Van Wagener. And that was right on the Snake Creek, right close to where the Deer Creek LDS Church is. Right behind that was the mill. And that was later where the Price family, H. Fred Price family, lived there. But anyway, with that grist mill, they would grind the wheat. And those big millstones, as they went around, sometimes they would give off a kind of a sandy-like thing that would get in the flour. And so sometimes the people would say, those Midway people have a lot of grist or what something, and it was in the flour. Anyway, so much for the little history of Midway.
And did you talk about, as a child, was Midway the place that most, when you were growing up, that you met your friends and hung out there?
Midway and Charleston, in fact, the whole valley. But the Midway had a theater. It was called the Real Theater. And that's where I went to the very first movies. And we would go there. It would cost like a dime to get into the show, the Real Theater. And then after we would get out of the show, there was a grocery store right beside the Real Theater. And the theater and the grocery store were owned by Guy Coleman. After the show, then we would go into the grocery store, and he would always, we would get an ice cream cone for a nickel. And I remember him reaching down into those big gallon, probably 5-gallon cans of cartons of ice cream, and you could almost see the steam coming out. And so we had the show plus ice cream cone, a dime plus a nickel, 15 cents. For 15 cents, we would have a big time out on the town. That's the cost of it. And in the theater, back then they had what they called the serials. And the serial is something that would go from one week to the next. It would continue on. That was kind of an incentive to get people to come back to the theater. And I always remembered those, and almost every week we'd go there. I had to see the serial, the next part of it. So I definitely remembered that, and that was taking place in Midway at that time.
What was your favorite cereal? Do you remember some of them?
Well, there was one, it was a cowboy kind of thing. It was called the Black Whip. And the person in it, the Black Whip, was a lady, and she had a black horse and a black whip. And she was the good person, and she would ride into the town on her horse, and the bad guys, she would confront them, and she would use her big long whip, a bull whip, a long one, and she could whip the guns right out of their hands with the bull whip. And I thought that was pretty good. And then she was a mystery to the people because they didn't know where she came from. So they would try following her. And they followed her, and they would always lose track of her because she would go to where there was some falls coming off of a cliff, and she would go behind the falls, and that's where she would always hide. But there were every week there was a new episode of that, the Black Whip.
So tell me a little bit more about your early childhood here in the Valley, and that could include the good stuff and the bad stuff. Maybe during the Depression. I think I've heard you mention that during the Depression.
Yeah. Well, let me tell you about when I started school in the first grade. We didn't have kindergarten when I started out. Never went one day to kindergarten, but went to first grade. And right at that time is when the Deer Creek Reservoir had come in. And when that came in, that took half of the town of Charleston out. And it took half of the land of Charleston underwater. So when I started school in the first grade, there were 5 students in the first grade. There was one other boy beside myself and 3 girls. That was the 5 that was in the first grade. And of course, with 5 students, you got to know them well, and you did a lot of things. Sometimes they even rode horses to school. And I remember the other boy in my class, he rode his horse to school, and I remember at recess that we got on the horse, he and I, and it didn't have a saddle on it, and it started down the road. It was just a gravel road by the school, and it kind of ran away, and I was holding on to him in front of me. We were on the same horse, and I was frightened to death. I thought for sure I'd be falling off, and it probably would have killed me if I'd have fallen off. So I remembered that, a little story. And when I was in about the 3rd or 4th grade, they didn't have a refrigerator in the school at that time. And so then I think it was about the 3rd or 4th grade teacher at Christmas time, she says, we're going to have a party. We're going to have a Christmas party. And she says, if all of you students, and at that time some of the grades were joined together, 2nd and 3rd together into one room, she says, if you will all bring a dime, that she would buy some ice cream, and we would have an ice cream party for our Christmas party. And so then on that day, she brought, I don't know, maybe like a gallon of ice cream to school. And there wasn't a refrigerator in the school, so she told me and 2 other boys to go behind the schoolhouse and put this ice cream in a big snow bank. And it was a big bank of snow. We dug a hole down in it and put the ice cream down in the snow bank, and then went back into the school. And then it came time to have the party, and so our teacher sent us 3 boys out to get the ice cream. And when we got out there, something had happened. We saw the ice cream carton scattered all around on top of the snow. And then we found out that a dog had gotten into it and eaten and taken care of the ice cream. So we went back into the schoolroom, and we were so disappointed. We all were about ready to cry, and we told the teacher, and we didn't know what to do. No ice cream. That kind of ruined our Christmas party. But the teacher was so kind and considerate after that, maybe not that same day, but she came back and gave every one of us a dime back after that. So anyway, right across from the school,
Charleston.
In Charleston, yes, that's where I went to school, 6 years there. There was a big barn there, a hay barn, huge, and it was called the tithing barn for the LDS Church, the Charleston Ward. And at that time, it was, used for nothing but hay and well, at one time it had produce and all of that in it. So during recess, some of us boys would sneak across the road where the barn was and play in that big barn. And all the time I remember we'd get up in the hay and we would jump off the hay on some hay down below, and we got so good we could do a somersault in the air and land down on the hay. And so then we got back to school, and we got a Scotch blessing for doing that, going over to the barn during recess.
What's a Scotch blessing?
That means a tough one.
A tough one.
That's an old saying, a Scotch blessing.
Do you remember anything from the Depression years here?
Well, my parents went through the Depression, and everything that we did and they did was kind of as a reminder of what happened during the Depression. And so actually I didn't live during the Depression, but right after it, so it was almost the same thing as living in the Depression, because my parents wanted to be prepared if a depression ever happened again. And so it was a matter of storing food. My parents would put up fruit and that, and we had a cellar. We grew our own potatoes, we had our own milk, we had our own meat, we had our own eggs. We could live off the land, off of our farm, without even going to the store. And we only went to a store very seldom, with maybe every few weeks, and we were 3 miles away from Heber. In the wintertime, when the roads, after the roads would get soft, they weren't paved roads, they were just gravel, and they would get big ruts in them. I remember that when we were going to Heber. Sometimes we would get stuck with our cars in the road, and we'd have to get out of the car and somebody push to get us out of the ruts going to Heber. The food was rationed. A lot of things were rationed back then, and you would buy ration books, and they had stamps in them, and like sugar, for example, you had to turn in stamps to get sugar. And I could tell a lot of stories about sugar too, but anyway, go on.
And that would be as it continued on during the World War
I
II.
remember when World War II actually started, we got the newspaper and came into the house, and I was standing right beside my parents. And they read there, Japan declares war, and U.S. declared war back on the bombing of Pearl Harbor. In fact, I have the newspaper of that with my dad's name on it. Japan declares war on the U.S. And so I remember seeing my parents and how shocked they were to see that. And I could see the fear in their faces as a little boy looking up at them as they read that. And then, of course, all the battles that took place during World War II, and you would see those wars that took place, the battles, Iwo Jima, the Philippines, Guam, and all of those things. And every time you'd read about it and the number of casualties, it was just shocking. 10,000 killed in one battle. You know, things like that. 2 of the boys from Charleston, Bob Edwards and Dale Carlson, were killed in World War II. And one of those, well, they were both Eagle Scouts, both of those young boys, and one became the Charleston Boy Scout Master, the Scoutmaster, and he was killed in World War II, the Scoutmaster of the Charleston Ward. And likewise in World War I, our neighbor over here, and that was before my time, George W. Carlisle, he was killed in World War I, the only one from Charleston that was killed in that war. So 3 soldiers from Charleston have lost their lives in the wars.
John, tell us about the dairy. I know your family was involved with dairy, and I know you know a lot about the dairy farms around here, and you can.
Yeah, well, back then, almost every farm, almost all the people were farmers, and they all had a few cows. and they milked the cows by hand, and that's what we did. I remember milking the cows by hand. In fact, I was 20 years old when we had got milking machines to milk the cows. And so we started milking cows. My grandparents, for all of those years, we milked cows for 130 years on the farm. But I'm not 130 years old, but that's how long we milked cows. And at one time a survey was made here in the valley by Wilby Young, who was on the Utah Dairy Commission. And he went around and made a count of all of the dairy farms in the valley, and that included Wallsburg too. And it was like 270 dairies in this valley, and now there's two dairies left out of 270. But they were small dairies, you know, maybe half a dozen cows or a dozen cows. And at our place, my mother and my dad and my aunt and my uncle, who were my mother's, one was a sister and one was a brother to my mother, they helped, so there would be 4 milking the cows, 2 women and 2 men. An aunt, yes. So anyway, so we milked cows, and then over the years it progressed, you know, newer equipment and that, and we went through those things all the time. We had to harvest the hay in the summertime to start out with horses, horse-driven equipment for harvesting the crops, hay and grain and potatoes. We always would grow enough potatoes to like even a ton, sometimes 2 tons of potatoes, and we would store those in our cellar, an underground cellar on the farm, and enough to last us all year long, at least most of the winter, during the winter, but then they get soft in the summer and you can't keep them.
Mm-hmm. Tell me about your immediate family, your brothers and sisters, and maybe part of, let's start with that, and then we can go on to your education.
Well, my wife and I, that's quite a story too, how we met, but anyway, we had 6 children, 5 girls and 1 boy, and one of the girls passed away as a little baby. And then we took in a foster Indian son when he was 8 years old. He was from Fort Wingate, New Mexico, came to us at 8 years old, stranger to us, and we raised him, and he's still with us. He's now in his 60s, like 62 years old. He comes to see us all the time, helps me all the time, and he has a wonderful family of his own. He married an Indian girl and 4 children, and they've been college graduates and all of that. And then with their own children, they have all graduated from college and all have families. We have 30 grandchildren and 8 great-grandchildren at the present time. And they live in so many different places, but 3 of them live here in the valley. And they come and help me out all the time, bring me food, more than I need. And so, yeah.
And tell me about your education.
My education?
Yeah.
Okay, well, elementary school in Charleston, that's 6th grades, and Wasatch High School. And when I was in Wasatch High School, I went there as a 7th grader. And so the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grades were all in the same building. And that was at Wasatch High School. So as a 7th grader, I was associating in the hallways with 12th graders. Wonderful time, wonderful experiences that I had there. And I rode on a school bus that went 10 miles to get to the school. And although I could have walked, which was 3 miles away, but it took about an hour on the bus to get there. So either walking or riding the bus was about the same. And so graduated from Wasatch High School, then went on to BYU, graduated from BYU, taught school for 33 years.
And you're quite a bit of educators in your family, right?
With my brother and my sister, every one of them graduated from BYU, and all of their spouses also, and all taught school, all school teachers. So when we get together, it was like having a teacher's institute.
And you're meeting your wife?
Meeting my wife?
Yeah, how you met your wife?
Well, I started, we found out later on that we actually graduated from BYU the same year in the same graduating class, but we didn't know each other, never met each other, but we were both in elementary education. And so when we started teaching, she started teaching in Mesa, Arizona, and I started teaching in Lehigh. And I only taught in Lehigh for 1 month, and I had been in the Utah National Guard for 7 years, and our unit was activated by the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy, and it was during the Berlin crisis. And so I had to leave the schoolroom after teaching 1 month, and I was in the Army, went up to Fort Lewis, Washington. So I was up in the state of Washington when my wife-to-be was in Arizona, never knew each other. And I spent a year up there in the Army in Fort Lewis, and when I got back from there, I went to a dance in the old Heber Social Hall. And it just so happened, and that was during the summertime, that my wife, whose name was Jane, she happened to be there with the BYU Western Club and had come there just as visiting for the dance, and the whole group of BYU students were there. And I just sit there 1 week after I got back looking at everybody. I never danced with anybody, but I noticed one person there that I remembered, and that turned out to be my wife. I never met her, I never danced with her, I didn't know her name, I didn't know where she was from. But a year went by, a whole year, and never heard of her again, never thought of her anymore. And then I was at a dance down in Provo, and I went to a few of them down there. In fact, I even took a few dancing classes. But the reason I remembered her, she was the best dancer that was on the floor there in Heber at the social hall. And so anyway, I was there at that dance, and here she walked in with another friend of hers. And that's where I saw her, and I got enough courage to ask her for a dance. And so we danced. I told her my name. She told me her name. She told me where she was from. I told her where I was from. And she said that she was from Mammoth, Utah. Mammoth, Utah was a mining town. And that was the place she was born, Mammoth. It's by Eureka. And then after that, she grew up in Springville. But there, the little town of Mammoth became a ghost town, and it's still a ghost town now. And right off, we knew that we were meant for each other, and we dated for a year, and then we were married.
And tell me about your children.
My own children?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll start with Mary Jane. Mary Jane is the oldest, and she's kind of paved the way for the rest of the family. I know she keeps journals and histories. She has over 50 journals. Every year of her life, she has a full journal, and she has 50 or more scrapbooks besides the journals. She was a Sterling Scholar in high school, English Sterling Scholar, and excelled in, well, it was English, wasn't it? English, but excelled in sports. She was in track and cross country and in so many different things like that. And our next daughter was Christine, and she, likewise, they all graduated from Wasatch High School, honor students and Sterling Scholars and so forth. but they were all in the athletics. And Christine, for example, in track, she did, one of the things she did was the long jump. Wasatch High School, still, her record still holds at Wasatch High School on the long jump, 18.5 feet for a girl. And then she was on the BYU track team as well. And then the next daughter, Diana, likewise was in track. In fact, she just received a reward for being a track with Wasatch High School this year, the assistant coach. And she's done that with the high school for years, even though she has a family and other things, but she still goes and helps with the track team. And she competed in college and went to Rick's College to start out with, and then Utah State University. And in track, she went to the Nationals back in Odessa, Texas, and she competed in the heptathlon. The heptathlon is where they do seven different track events, and then the total score is added up. She was second in the nation, so she's an All-American. And her youngest daughter, likewise in track, and she went and did the hurdles. She was an All-American too. She was in the top 10 in the United States. And then our boy, he was associated or did all kinds of sports. He was on the high school basketball team and football team and track and all of that. And he still lives here he built his home here on the farm. And then our Indian boy, of course, then we raised him, and he graduated from BYU. And his wife too, and his wife still works at BYU in the Multicultural Center. She's worked there for 40 years, just going on 40 years.
And your son?
And John David, he runs the farm here, and served a mission to Louisiana, and works over at the Kohler Dairy. At the present time runs the robot milkers. After we got through with the dairy here, then he went over there and he runs the robot milkers for the cheese factory for the farm. He works in the dairy barn there. Did I get them all? I think. But I did tell all of their history. That was just a drop in the bucket.
Well, I'm going to go back to growing up along the Provo River, because I know you've written a book about that.
Yeah. Well, the Provo River, we had grazing land down there, and we had to take our cows there for every day. And so I would take the cows to the pasture, which was about a half a mile away, and I would usually take them by walking, and then in the evening, then I'd go over to the pasture and bring them back. And I did that for years, hundreds of trips, and I'd have to cross the Provo River. And to start out with, there wasn't any bridge across it, and so we'd have to go, and it was in the bottoms, we call it the river bottoms. And I just almost grew up in those river bottoms. I loved it, and I did a lot of exploring there. I often wondered, as I walked along those streams and those ponds and those trees and everything, and underbrush, and it was a little bit scary. I thought, I wonder if Jim Bridger ever walked along here, or the Smith, Jedediah Smith. Mm-hmm. They were the old mountain men, and then so I fished in the river, and I watched the big fish come up, spawners in the fall. The backs of the fish would stick right out of the water. And actually back then, when I was really young, we used those for meat. We would catch enough of those to do us through the winter, and we would keep them in snow, and that we didn't have a refrigerator, but my dad would catch those, and my dad was a trapper, and he trapped muskrats, and that was just to bring in a little revenue for the family, muskrats and mink and beaver. And so I did that too somewhat, and I made a little spending money, just a few dollars from trapping them, and that helped me as to have a little bit of spending money. And I camped out down there in the river bottoms, and when I was a scoutmaster, we did a lot of working on merit badges in that area. I fell in the river once and nearly drowned. I was fishing, and the river was high, and I wasn't catching too many, and so I saw that island out kind of in the middle of the river, and I tried to get out to it with my boots on, hip boots, and my fishing pole, and it was so strong that it started pushing me downstream, and I could feel me slipping over the rocks with my boots and that, and finally it pushed me down so far that I dropped off into deeper water, and pretty soon the water was clear up around my neck. I had the hip boots on, and I was struggling to stay above water. I had a friend that was over on the bank, and I was trying to swim, but with those heavy boots, it was heavy, of course, and holding me down, but I was hitting the bottom of the river every so often, and I had to drop my fishing pole. I had a brand new reel on it, and I felt so bad about that, but it took me down the river for maybe a half a block or longer, and I was finally able to work myself close enough to the bank that I got out of the river. But so many things. I just loved camping out down there. One night I camped out there on the river bank, and I was about a junior in high school, and I had with some of my friends, we camped out there, wanted to camp out there. I told my mother, I said, well, we're going to camp out. And my mother was kind of opposed to it. She said, that river's so high. She said, it's too dangerous. Don't get near that. But I finally talked her into it, and so we went down to the river, the group of us, and got her tent set up, and I remember being in the tent there that evening, and I went to sleep, and we'd build a bonfire about maybe 50 feet away from where we had the tent, and I could hear the river roaring and I guess it made me have some wild dreams, because in my sleep, while I was still asleep, I got up and got out of the tent and walked, and when I woke up, I was sitting by a tree right where we'd had the bonfire. There were still hot coals in it, and I was scared, and so then I walked back and was able to get back into the tent. The flaps were still tied. I don't know how I got out, but I had dozens of stories like that in the Provo River bottoms. That's why I wrote a book about it, all of those stories, tons of them.
And we'll link to
and
that.
It meant a lot to me. I loved it, and I still look out over the Provo River right now. Right from my window, I can see it when the water is high.
When you're talking about the Provo River, are you talking, the river bottom? Geographically, where was that in the valley? Or?
Between Deer Creek Reservoir and Jordanelle. But
okay.
I was here closer to home.
Yeah.
When I was with my dad and he was trapping, in the wintertime he would use snowshoes. And when I was young, and he'd have to go across the river too, he'd have the hip boots on, and I would ride on his back. I would jump up on his back, and he would take me across the river, but I could feel him slipping too on the slick rocks, but he never did fall down or that, but I was scared to death that he might fall down and I'd be right in the river, but I followed right in his tracks. And sometimes his tracks were quite a ways apart, and I had to take big steps to step in his tracks in the snow when he was walking. But I loved all of those things, hunting, fishing, trapping, and just observation of all the animals. I've looked out here in the river bottoms, and within an hour's time, I have counted sometimes 12 different species of birds looking out my window within an hour's time. Just watching them. I watched swans build a nest down here in the river bottoms and raise a little swan, watched it all summer long. I wrote a story about it. It was called Summer of the Swans. That's the name of a book. And I wrote a story, called it The Summer of the Swans. And I grow hummingbirds right here. They're here, I know when they leave, I know when they come back. And They're here now by the dozens. Here I saw 4 or 5 at one time, here this morning even. And I knew when they came right around Mother's Day every year, and then in the fall, then they leave. Within a week's time, they all leave. I watch the robins every year when they come. They usually come in the first week in March. They come here, and I know that spring's on its way when the robins come. And I like to see all the animals, the birds, everything about it. The trees, the rivers, the ponds, the mountains in the background. The beauties of nature. Couldn't ask. I live in paradise.
We do, for sure. Should we? One of. No, I've got a concluding one. So if you.
Maybe you could tell us a little bit about some of your responsibilities you've had in the church here in the area.
Okay. I'd be glad to. Yes, as a young boy growing up, and we lived 3 miles away from the Charleston church house, and my parents weren't really all that active, but yes, they were members of the church, and later in life became very, very active. In fact, my mother, when she was 77 years old, had to have her leg amputated clear above the knee, and so she was in a wheelchair there, and then they were very active in the LDS church. But I became a deacon, and that was right after the Charleston church house. The old one had burnt down. I watched it burn down. I watched the people crying as it burnt down, and so I was interviewed to become a deacon. The biggest bishop's office I had ever been in, because we were in the Charleston Elementary School, and it was the gymnasium. The gymnasium was the bishop's office. And so I was a deacon, became a deacon president, and I was influenced for good from so many nice people and boys and that. And one of the boys that impressed me, and I didn't really know him very much in the church, but I just felt his spirit. And he passed away at a young age when he was about 21 years old. And probably 50 years after that, and I often thought about him, and about 50 years after that, I was at a yard sale, and they had I noticed a Boy Scout handbook. And I picked up that book, and I said, can I buy that? And they said, yes. I said, how much? They said, well, maybe, 25 cents. So I paid 25 cents for it. And when I got home, I was looking in that book. And I opened it up, and it was the name of that boy. And it was really touching to me. Felt like crying when I saw that and his name in it, because he was the one that really influenced my life, And then after that, I went on a mission to California, and there was a California mission. Their headquarters was in Los Angeles, right by the Los Angeles Temple. And my first area was in Flagstaff, Arizona, a long ways away from the mission home, hundreds of miles. And the mission included California and Arizona as one mission. And I was in Flagstaff, Arizona there, and it was quite a wonderful experience, and so far away from the mission president, And then, and of course, a lot of other places, but another place I ended up was in Ridgecrest, California. And Ridgecrest was a Navy military base out in the middle of the Mojave Desert, a Navy base. It's hard to imagine, but that's where it was. And it was Death Valley is where it was. And I worked in all of those little communities around Death Valley. And Death Valley is way below sea level, but wonderful experiences there, And then, of course, I was a scoutmaster for 8 years, and then worked in the scouting program for close to 20 years. I served in as an elders president. I served in the Charleston Ward bishopric, and well, and a lot of other things too, different missions. I actually served a mission when I was in the Army in Fort Lewis at the same time, because we would get to leave on Saturdays, and I did missionary work on Saturdays while I was stationed at Fort Lewis. And since then I've served on stake missions and ward missions and so forth.
You mentioned that you would go to the movies on Main Street in Midway. Where was the movie theater?
Located?
Yeah.
Well, right where, what's the big grocery store is now, but right close to the corner, Center Street and Main Street.
Okay.
Right close to that.
Was it close to the cannery building, the social hall?
No, going the other way. Center Street, going west from Center Street. Just maybe like 100 feet, I swear, because there was a whole row of grocery stores and the theater.
John, do you remember anything about the early days of having Swiss days? Did you go to some of the early Swiss days events that they had over there?
Yes, a lot of them, and participated in a lot of them. And at one time, under President Stone, they did what was called the Legacy, and we did a display there by the Midway Stake Center outside. We had covered wagons and hand carts and just pioneer settings there. So we did a lot of that.
For Swiss days?
For Swiss days, yes.
So as with some German background that you have, there was at one time a place called the German Hall over in Midway. Did that still exist when you were young?
No, it didn't, but I know about it. In fact, half of my ancestors were there and are in the picture of that, and it was called the German Hall, and that's where they met, and they spoke the German language. And I have a picture here in my museum, and it shows it shows my dad as just a little boy in that. And then later on, it was the music hall, also for Midway, and John Huber was the music director and taught music in that building. And it's right where the Zangers live. In fact, they said the foundation is still there, under maybe one of those houses. But that was a German hall.
So that was kind of a cultural center then?
And a church for them too, yes. Whatever they used it for.
Go ahead.
Oh, we're,
I think you should talk about the museum, because that was such a big part of your life.
do you want to do that, Bob?
Don't look at me. I'm just a technical guy.
Well,
I think we should have that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think what we
well,
should do is just be careful, like, Jeff said out there, the publication of it. But, again, we don't have to. We could keep that separate, right, Steve?
Well, I can mention just about it,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
Because it played such a big,
No.
important part of his life.
That's
And,
was kind of what
it's
we
his
came,
history.
but
Yeah.
then again, we
And
didn't
maybe,
want to.
and maybe also touch on some of your favorite things that you've got, like your favorite 5 things from your whole collection.
That would be good. Yeah.
I've never ranked them according to.
Thank you for. Also keep
About
Are we
his
ready?
teaching.
Are we
his teaching yours. And talk
Yeah.
about your school teaching too.
School
school
teaching.
teaching.
Yeah, we didn't really cover that too much.
Yeah, let's do the school teaching a little bit, and then we can touch about your
Museum a little.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just so you know, we're an hour and 8 minutes in, so
Do you need to
batteries are gonna
change?
start changing and cards are gonna
Is
run
this
out, so
Is this a good
do
time?
these 2 questions and try and get
Okay.
them all in the next 10 minutes if you
Okay,
can.
but you can change it if we need
I
more
can change
time.
it,
Yeah.
I'm just Making you aware, we're already over an hour. So.
Yeah, that's good. So, John, tell us about your teaching career.
My teaching career.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I started teaching after graduating from BYU. I started teaching in Lehigh, and that's where I only taught for 1 month and went into the Army. But after I came back from the Army, then I continued teaching there for 2 more years, same room, a year later, and then I taught, that was 6th grade. And then I taught 6th grade at Orem Junior High School for 1 year. And then after that, then and back at that time, I was single. I wasn't married. And likewise, my wife to be was also teaching school during that time. And then after that, then I got a job at the Central School in Heber and taught there 6th grade for approximately 15 years. And then after that, I went to Midway and taught there for like another 15 years, 6 grades, and some of that was 4th grades also. I started teaching in Midway at the same time the new Midway Elementary School opened up. So they were still working on it when we moved into the school and started teaching there. And that's where I ended up teaching 33 years, school teaching.
And your brother also was.
And my brother was also teaching, and he taught, I guess, about the same number of years, and he was the principal of the Midway Elementary School, and he taught also in the old Pot Rock Midway Elementary School, and was principal there too.
And tell us about your incredible hobby and your museum.
Yeah. Well, because of our farm being old, and that was a place where there were a lot of old equipment and so forth, and I was always I wanted to preserve history too, and one time my wife and I knew about, and she enjoyed old things too. But I did some work for a person, custom work, cutting and baling hay. And when he wanted to pay me, but he said he didn't have enough money. And he said that he had some wagon wheels. And he said, would you like those wagon wheels for pay? And I said, oh yes, I just love that. And so he gave me those wagon wheels. When my wife saw them, she was just astounded because she loved wagon wheels. And so basically, that was the starting of our museum, and she wanted to pursue it. She liked those things, you know, and she'd kind of grew up a little bit on a farm too, and so it just flourished from then on, and one thing after another. But it all came about piece by piece. A little here, a little there, line upon line and precept upon precept is the way the museum came about. And as I look back on it now, I don't know how it happened. I don't know how it came about. There's no way in the world I could ever duplicate it, you know, or even if I had my life to live over, I couldn't have done it. And I don't know why it came about. I think it was meant to be. I sometimes say it was manna from heaven, whatever that means. It came about.
It is amazing, absolutely amazing.
I have had people come here and go through it, and just the minute they step into the first building, I've seen them gasp. They said, I feel something here. I feel something here. It's spiritual, it's educational. And so anyway, it came about.
Excellent. What is some advice that you would give to your grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and maybe some of, generations to come? Something that you've learned in your life and want to share with the next generations?
Yeah, well, because of my heritage, and learning even about my ancestors, and that meant a lot to me, and that was a base, that was a foundation for everything. And I worked hard. I grew up on a farm. I knew what work was about. I learned the meaning of work, and I wanted my children to work hard at whatever they're doing, be good citizens, love other people, love their neighbors, and all of those things. And of course, they were all active in the church that we belonged to, and that meant a lot to me, and I wanted them to be that too. And I never used force. I never had to give one of them a licking ever. I maybe used maybe an unkind word once in a while, very seldom, but I loved them with all my heart, and I just want that feeling to pass on to the next generation.
Very nice. Thank you so much, John. And we can add to it as we go along, but thank you for everything today. Unless you have, go ahead and...
One of the things that I have is my great-grandfather's military uniform and his sword, which was made in 1837 in Springfield, Illinois, the same place Abraham Lincoln lived, and his cane. And I have those in my possession, and they've been passed down like 4 generations to me. And I normally, I don't put those out in the open or show them to people, but I will at any time, anybody that wants to see them, and I show it to them. The sword, the uniform, and the cane. And that one ancestor right there, William Wallace Casper, for example, he was in the Mormon battalion. And then he and his wife, when they were ready to come across the plains, they were there in winter quarters, and the call came from the President of the United States for an enlistment of 500 men to be in the Mormon battalion. And so my great-grandfather was in that, and that left his wife and a little baby girl that was just 1 year old, and to make their way across the plains without the husband. And when they left, they departed that day from each other. And he said to her, he says, "You are in the hands of the same God that I am, and may he be with us until we meet again." He went one way, she went the other way. He went clear to, with 500 men walking, the longest military march in history, and clear to the Mexican border, California, and that's where he was discharged a year later. Came back across the Sierra Nevada mountains, saw even the remains of the Donner Party, and made it back to the Salt Lake Valley. And getting into the Salt Lake Valley in 1847, in the same year, just a little, 3 months after Brigham Young and the earlier ones made it there. And in the meantime, his wife, Sarah Ann Bean Casper, she came across the plains with a little 1-year-old baby, and with the help of her younger brother, 15 years old, they made it to the Salt Lake Valley. And they got to the valley just 1 week before that her husband, William Wallace Casper, came from the other direction. They entered the Salt Lake Valley from different directions. They had no communication from each other for a year's time. They didn't know where each other was. They didn't even know if each other was alive. They didn't even know if they would ever meet again, but they did. That impressed me. And I got lots of stories like that, with my ancestors. That was a base for me, what they went through. If they could do that, maybe I can do something like that too. Well, not like that, but, and likewise, my family, I hope those same things can be instilled in their lives too. I know they'll do okay if they can keep some of those faith promoting things that's happened in our family over the years.
Very blessed. Thank
Okay.
you, John. Oh my gosh. That was so.
I could add just one little thing, maybe that isn't on here, but the little baby that came across the plains, it was 1 year old, she, in time, married a fellow, his name was Ebenezer Hanks, and they settled in southern Utah, and the town is now named after them, Hanksville, Utah, from that little 1 year old baby.